Walter had always been a man of modest dreams and even simpler means. Life had taught him the art of getting by without complaint. Now in his early 70s, Walter lived alone in a small, creaky house on the outskirts of town. The house, like its owner, had seen better days. It was a place filled with memories of his late wife, Margaret, whose laughter once echoed in every corner. The faded floral curtains she had picked out years ago still hung by the windows, though they now swayed in silence. Walter had never brought himself to change much since she passed 5 years ago. Her absence left a void that no amount of time could fill. The days were long, and the nights often felt even longer. Solitude was no stranger to Walter. It accompanied him in the quiet hours when the world outside seemed so distant and indifferent. Walter's routine was as predictable as the sunrise. Each morning, he woke up with the first rays of light, brewed himself a pot of tea, and sat by the window to watch the world go by. He'd often take a slow walk to the park, where he fed breadcrumbs to the pigeons and occasionally exchanged polite nods with strangers he passed. Evenings were spent reading old novels, their pages yellowed and their stories worn, much like himself. But despite the predictability, Walter carried a sense of nostalgia, clinging to memories of a simpler, happier time when his life was full of love and laughter. Those memories, bittersweet as they were, sustained him. On one particularly biting November afternoon, the kind where the wind seemed to creep through every crack and crevice, Walter decided to visit the local thrift store. It wasn't a necessity, he didn't particularly need anything, but thrift stores had always intrigued him. He liked to think of them as little museums of forgotten lives, filled with objects that once meant something to someone. As he stepped inside, the familiar scent of old books and second-hand fabric greeted him. Walter slowly wandered through the aisles, letting his fingers trail over the items on display. There were chipped teacups, tarnished silverware, and stacks of records from an era long gone. It wasn't until he reached the coat rack that something caught his eye. Among the rows of jackets and overcoats was a plain woolen coat, its dark gray fabric slightly frayed at the edges. There was nothing particularly remarkable about it, yet Walter felt drawn to it. It reminded him of a coat his father used to wear on their fishing trips back when he was a boy. He remembered how his father would drape it over his shoulders, and how it always smelled faintly of pipe tobacco. With a wistful smile, Walter took the coat off the rack and tried it on. It was a little big for him, but it felt warm and familiar, as though it had been waiting for him. He glanced at the price tag, $10. A small price for something that already seemed to carry so much sentimental value. Walter brought the coat home that day, hanging it carefully by the door before settling into his usual evening routine. Over the next few days, the coat became a favorite. He wore it on his morning walks, where it shielded him from the biting wind, and during his errands, where shopkeepers complimented him on how distinguished it looked. It wasn't until a particularly cold evening, as Walter sat in his armchair by the fireplace, that he discovered the coat held more than warmth. As he reached into the deep pocket for no particular reason, his fingers brushed against something unexpected. Pulling it out, he found a small, folded piece of paper, a lottery ticket. Walter squinted at the ticket, holding it up to the light. The numbers were neatly printed, the ink slightly faded, but the ticket itself was still intact. He chuckled softly, amused at the idea of someone leaving a lottery ticket in a coat. "What are the chances it's even valid?" he muttered to himself. He turned it over in his hands, noting the faint scent of cologne clinging to the paper, a detail that struck him as oddly personal. For a moment, he wondered who the previous owner might have been. What kind of life had they lived? Why had they given up the coat? And more importantly, had they ever realized the ticket was still inside? Placing the ticket on his coffee table, Walter dismissed it as a curious little find, not worth much thought. Yet as the evening wore on, he found his gaze drifting toward it again and again. There was something about the ticket that tugged at him, a quiet mystery waiting to be unraveled. It wasn't about the money, Walter wasn't the kind of man to chase riches, but rather the story behind it. Who had purchased it? What were their hopes when they chose those numbers? And what twist of fate had led it to him? As the fire crackled softly in the background, Walter couldn't shake the feeling that the coat and its hidden treasure had found their way to him for a reason. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of curiosity, a sense of anticipation that made him look forward to tomorrow. The next morning, Walter awoke to the familiar sound of the old cuckoo clock in his living room. Its cheerful chime had always been a small comfort, marking the steady passage of time in a life that often felt unremarkable. But today, as he poured himself a cup of tea and sat down in his usual spot by the window, something felt different. His thoughts kept circling back to the lottery ticket he found in the pocket of the thrift store coat. It sat there on the coffee table, an unassuming little slip of paper, and yet it seemed to demand his attention. After a long moment of hesitation, Walter reached for it, feeling the slight crinkle of the paper between his fingers. Why not check, he murmured to himself, more out of curiosity than any real expectation. The lottery numbers were printed neatly at the bottom, with a date that, to Walter's mild surprise, wasn't as old as he'd expected. It was from last month, still within the window to claim a prize if, by some miracle, it was a winner. He fumbled for his reading glasses, which he kept perpetually perched on the side table, and carefully scrutinized the numbers. They seemed random at first glance, but there was an odd sense of familiarity about them. Shaking off the thought, Walter retrieved his old laptop from the kitchen counter and powered it up, the whirring fan a reminder of how outdated it was. After a slow, clunky start, he navigated to the state lottery website and found the page listing the winning numbers for the draw in question. With each number he compared, Walter's heart began to pound just a little harder. The first number matched, then the second. His pulse quickened as the third, fourth, and fifth numbers lined up perfectly. By the time he reached the final number, his hands were trembling so much that he had to set the laptop aside for fear of dropping it. He stared at the ticket in disbelief, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "This can't be right," he whispered, though his voice trembled with an excitement he hadn't felt in years. A wave of nervous energy surged through him as he checked the numbers again, then a third time, desperate for confirmation. Each time the result was the same. Walter was holding a winning lottery ticket worth millions of dollars. For a man who had spent his entire life living modestly, the reality of such a fortune was almost too much to comprehend. He sat back in his chair, the ticket clutched tightly in his hand, as a flood of emotions washed over him. There was joy, of course, a kind of giddy, unexpected elation that made him feel like a child discovering a hidden treasure. But there was also fear. Walter had never been a man of means, and the thought of handling such an immense sum of money was daunting. What would he do with it? How would it change his life? Did he even want his life to change? As the initial shock began to subside, practical questions started to surface. Was the ticket truly legitimate? How would he go about claiming the prize? And perhaps most importantly, was it even right for him to keep it? The last question lingered in his mind, casting a shadow over his excitement. The ticket wasn't his, not really. It had belonged to someone else, someone who had either lost it or forgotten it in the pocket of the coat. Walter couldn't help but wonder about the person who had originally purchased it. Had they known it was a winner? Had they deliberately left it behind, or had it been an accident? The weight of these questions bore down on him as he sat in his quiet living room, staring out the window at the bare trees swaying in the cold wind. He thought about Margaret and how she would have handled such a discovery. She had always been the practical one, but she was also kind to a fault, never hesitating to do what was right even if it meant sacrificing her own comfort. Walter sighed, feeling the pang of her absence more acutely than ever. "What would you do, Maggie?" he asked aloud, his voice barely more than a whisper. By mid-afternoon, Walter decided he needed to take a walk to clear his head. He slipped on the thrift store coat, the ticket safely tucked back into its pocket, and made his way to the park. The familiar routine of feeding the pigeons brought him a small measure of peace, but his mind remained restless. The world around him seemed brighter, more vivid, as though the weight of the ticket in his pocket had shifted his perception. The distant laughter of children, the rustle of leaves in the wind, even the smell of freshly brewed coffee from a nearby cafe. It all felt sharper, more alive. As he sat on his usual bench, watching the pigeons peck at breadcrumbs, Walter's thoughts turned to the ticket's previous owner once more. Who were they? Had they even realized what they had given up? And why had the coat, with its hidden treasure, found its way to him? The coincidence of it all felt almost too perfect, as though some unseen hand had orchestrated the entire event. For the first time, Walter allowed himself to entertain the possibility that this wasn't just random chance, that maybe, just maybe, the ticket had been meant for him. The walk did little to ease his mind, and by the time Walter returned home, the weight of his discovery felt heavier than ever. He sat down at the kitchen table, the ticket laid out before him like a puzzle waiting to be solved. As the evening shadows lengthened, he realized he had a decision to make. He could claim the prize and change his life forever, or he could embark on a journey to uncover the story behind the ticket and its mysterious appearance in his life. Either way, Walter knew one thing for certain: his life, so quiet and uneventful until now, would never be the same. Walter sat at his kitchen table, staring at the lottery ticket as though it held the answers to life's greatest mysteries. In a way, it did, or at least it felt like it could. The numbers, neatly printed and undeniably matching those of the winning draw, seemed to taunt him with their potential. Millions of dollars were now within his grasp, a fortune that could erase every worry he'd ever had about money. But the thought didn't bring him the joy he had expected. Instead, it filled him with a gnawing sense of unease. Walter had lived his entire life in modest comfort, never desiring much beyond what he already had. The idea of having so much, too much, felt alien, even unsettling. He leaned back in his chair, the old wood creaking under his weight, and let out a long sigh. The kitchen, usually his sanctuary, felt oddly stifling today. The hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder than usual, amplifying the silence that surrounded him. Walter's thoughts drifted to the life he'd built with Margaret. They had never been wealthy, but they had been happy. They had saved diligently, budgeted carefully, and found joy in the little things: a picnic by the lake, a handwritten love note tucked into a lunchbox, the simple pleasure of sharing a pot of tea on a rainy afternoon. Money had never defined their lives, and Walter wasn't sure he wanted it to define his now. Yet the ticket remained, an undeniable reality that couldn't be ignored. Walter picked it up again, turning it over in his hands as though the answers might be written on the back. What would Margaret have said if she were here? She would have smiled her gentle, knowing smile, the one that always made him feel like everything would be all right, no matter how complicated life seemed. "Walter, don't overthink it," she would have said, her voice calm and reassuring. But even as he imagined her words, he couldn't help but wonder if she would have encouraged him to keep the money or give it away. The idea of giving it away lingered in his mind like a stubborn shadow. It wasn't just about the money itself, but what it represented. The ticket wasn't his, not really. Someone else had purchased it, someone who had likely dreamed of the possibilities it could bring. Could he, in good conscience, claim the winnings as his own, knowing they had once belonged to someone else? The moral weight of the question pressed heavily on him, making his tea grow cold as he sat lost in thought. That evening, Walter found himself pacing the small living room, the ticket now tucked safely into his wallet. He had placed it there not because he had made a decision, but because he couldn't bear to leave it out in the open any longer. It felt too powerful, too dangerous, like a secret he wasn't ready to share with the world, or even with himself. As he paced, His mind wandered to the people in his life who might have opinions about what he should do. His neighbor, Mrs. Larson, was always quick to offer unsolicited advice, though it was often more nosy than helpful. The young man who mowed his lawn in the summer might have said to take the money and travel the world, but Walter wasn't sure he even wanted to leave town. The truth was, Walter had no one he felt comfortable confiding in. His closest friends had either passed away or moved to warmer climates, leaving him to navigate this strange, unexpected situation on his own. The isolation he had grown so accustomed to now felt suffocating, amplifying his doubts and fears. What if he made the wrong choice? What if the money brought more problems than it solved? What if, in trying to do the right thing, he ended up regretting it? Sleep eluded him that night, his mind churning with possibilities and questions. He thought about the things he could do with the money: fix up the house, donate to the local library, maybe even start a scholarship fund in Margaret's name. But for every idea that brought a flicker of excitement, there was an equally powerful wave of guilt. The ticket wasn't his. It had come to him by chance, or perhaps by fate, but it didn't feel earned. And Walter had always believed in earning what he had, in working hard and living honestly. By morning, he was no closer to an answer, but he knew he couldn't keep sitting in his house, paralyzed by indecision. He needed clarity, and he wasn't going to find it within the four walls of his home. Walter decided to take a walk, the coat wrapped snugly around him, and the ticket still tucked in his wallet. The brisk morning air did little to quiet his racing thoughts, but did offer a sense of purpose. As he walked, he found himself retracing his steps to the thrift store where he had bought the coat. Perhaps the answers weren't in the ticket, but in the coat itself, or more specifically, in the person who had owned it before him. The thrift store was quiet when he arrived, its shelves and racks a little emptier than they had been a few days ago. Walter approached the counter, where a young woman with bright pink hair and a kind smile was restocking a display of ceramic mugs. "Excuse me," he said, his voice hesitant but steady. "I bought a coat here a few days ago, and I was wondering if you might remember anything about it, or who donated it." The woman looked up, her expression curious. "A coat? We get so many donations, it's hard to keep track," she said. "What did it look like?" Walter described the coat as best he could, his words tinged with hope. The young woman nodded thoughtfully. "I think I remember that one," she said. "It came in with a batch of items from an estate sale. I'm not sure whose estate, though. Let me check our records." As she disappeared into the back room, Walter felt a strange mix of anticipation and trepidation. He wasn't sure what he was hoping to find, but he knew he needed to keep searching. When the young woman returned, she held a clipboard in her hands. "The coat came from an estate sale for a man named Edward Baker," she said. "Does that name mean anything to you?" Walter's heart skipped a beat. The name was familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. As he left the thrift store, clutching the slip of paper with the name and address of the estate sale organizer, he felt a new sense of purpose. The ticket might not be his, but its story wasn't finished yet, and neither, he realized, was his own. Walter's hands trembled slightly as he looked down at the address scribbled on the paper. Edward Baker. The name echoed in his mind like a faint melody he couldn't quite recall. There was something familiar about it, but the connection remained elusive. Determined to find out more, Walter tucked the note into his wallet alongside the ticket and made his way home. The brisk walk back to his house did little to settle the fluttering nerves in his chest. Who was Edward Baker? And why did his name stir something deep in Walter's memory? Once home, Walter sat down at his kitchen table, the slip of paper and ticket laid out in front of him like pieces of a puzzle. He decided to start with the simplest approach, a search online. His old laptop whirred to life as he opened the search engine and typed in the name Edward Baker along with the town's name. A list of results appeared, most of them mundane: an obituary, a few articles about local events, and a real estate listing for a property under the Baker name. Walter clicked on the obituary first, his eyes scanning the text for any hint of familiarity. Edward Baker, the obituary read, had passed away 3 months ago at the age of 76. A lifelong resident of the town, Edward had been a teacher at the local high school, a role he held for over 30 years. The article described him as kind, dedicated, and deeply loved by his students and colleagues. Walter's breath caught as a vague memory began to surface. A teacher. Could it be the same Mr. Baker who had taught him history all those decades ago? The realization sent a shiver down his spine. If it was the same man, then the coat and the ticket suddenly felt even more significant. The obituary mentioned that Edward had no immediate family, only a few distant relatives who had organized the estate sale. Walter's heart ached at the thought. A man who had dedicated his life to teaching and shaping young minds, leaving behind little more than his belongings. He felt a deep pang of guilt as he glanced at the lottery ticket. Had Edward purchased it, dreaming of a better life that never came? Or had it been a casual purchase, forgotten in the shuffle of his final days? The questions swirled in Walter's mind, each one adding to the growing weight of his discovery. Unable to shake the need for answers, Walter decided to visit the address listed for the estate sale organizer. It was a small office in the heart downtown, tucked between a bakery and a hardware store. The sign on the door read, Baker Estate Management, and Walter hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The office smelled faintly of old paper and lavender, and a young woman sitting at a desk looked up with a polite smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. Walter explained his situation carefully, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. He described the coat, the ticket, and his desire to learn more about Edward Baker. The woman listened intently, her expression softening as he spoke. "I remember that sale," she said. "Mr. Baker had a lot of interesting items. It was clear he'd lived a full life, though it's always sad to see someone's belongings reduced to an estate sale. The coat you mentioned, I believe it was part of a donation to the thrift store after the sale. He had no immediate heirs, so we arranged for many of his belongings to go to charity." The woman paused, her gaze thoughtful. "You said you found a lottery ticket in the coat?" she asked. Walter nodded, hesitant to reveal too much. "Well, Mr. Baker was known to play the lottery occasionally," she said. "He often joked about winning big and retiring to the countryside, though I suppose he never got the chance. It's possible he bought the ticket and forgot about it." Walter thanked the woman and left the office, his mind racing. The picture was becoming clearer, but it was far from complete. As he walked through the bustling streets, he found himself reflecting on his memories of Mr. Baker. If it was indeed the same teacher from his youth, then Walter owed him more than a passing thought. Mr. Baker had been one of the few teachers who had truly believed in Walter's potential, encouraging him to pursue his passions despite the challenges of his modest upbringing. Walter hadn't thought about those days in years, but now the memories came rushing back with startling clarity. Back at home, Walter sat in his armchair, the coat draped over his lap as he ran his fingers over its worn fabric. The connection between him and Mr. Baker felt almost too coincidental to be real, and yet the evidence was there. The coat, the ticket, the name. It all pointed to a deeper story, one that Walter felt compelled to uncover. But how far was he willing to go? The ticket was worth millions, and claiming it would change his life forever. But was it right to keep it, knowing it had belonged to a man who had once been so significant in his life? And if he chose to return it, or at least its winnings, to the estate, would it even make a difference? The moral dilemma weighed heavily on Walter's heart as he sat in the fading light of the evening. The ticket wasn't just a piece of paper anymore. It was a symbol of choices, of connections, and of the kind of man Walter wanted to be. For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of something larger than himself, a sense of purpose, of responsibility. The story behind the ticket was still unfolding, and Walter knew he had a role to play in its ending. With that thought, he made a quiet promise to himself. He would find the truth, no matter where it led him. The days that followed were a whirlwind of memories and emotions for Walter. He couldn't shake the name Edward Baker from his mind, nor the peculiar connection they now seemed to share through the thrift store coat and its hidden treasure. Determined to learn more, Walter began visiting places tied to his past, places where he had once crossed paths with Mr. Baker. He started with the old high school, now abandoned and weathered by time, its boarded windows and crumbling brick walls standing as a ghostly reminder of his youth. As he stood in front of the chain-link fence that encircled the building, Walter's mind drifted back to his teenage years. Mr. Baker had been more than just a teacher. He had been a guide, a mentor, and, at times, the only adult in Walter's life who seemed to truly care. Walter recalled the many afternoons he had spent in Mr. Baker's classroom after school, discussing history, philosophy, and life. Back then, Walter had been a restless boy with big dreams and little direction. It was Mr. Baker who would encourage him to think critically, to believe in himself, and to find beauty in even the smallest moments. But as much as Mr. Baker had been a force for good in Walter's life, their relationship had ended on a sour note. Walter hadn't thought about that day in years, but now the memory came rushing back with painful clarity. It had been his final year of high school, and Walter had gotten into an argument with Mr. Baker over a history paper. Walter, young and stubborn, had accused Mr. Baker of being unfair, of not understanding him. In his anger, he had said things he regretted almost immediately, but pride had kept him from apologizing. He had stormed out of the classroom that day, vowing never to return, and he hadn't. He had graduated without ever making amends, and life had carried him away from the man who had once meant so much to him. Now, standing outside the old school, Walter felt the weight of that regret more deeply than ever. He wondered if Mr. Baker had thought about him over the years, if he had carried any bitterness about their falling out. And he wondered if the coat, with its hidden ticket, was some kind of cosmic bridge between their lives, giving Walter a chance to make things right, even if Mr. Baker was no longer here to see it. Determined to find more answers, Walter reached out to one of the distant relatives mentioned in Mr. Baker's obituary. After some polite conversation, the relative, a woman named Clara, agreed to meet him at a local cafe. She was in her 40s, with kind eyes and a warm demeanor, and she seemed genuinely curious about Walter's connection to Mr. Baker. As they sipped coffee, Walter explained everything: the coat, the ticket, and his memories of Mr. Baker as a teacher. Clara listened intently, her expression softening as Walter recounted his story. "Uncle Edward was a special man," she said, her voice tinged with affection. "He had this way of making everyone feel important, like they mattered. Even at family gatherings, he was the one who brought people together, who made us all laugh and think. But he was also a man with his share of pain." Walter's brow furrowed. "What kind of pain?" he asked gently. Clara hesitated, her gaze dropping to the table for a moment. "He never spoke about it much, but there was an event in his life that changed him," she said. "He lost a friend, someone very close to him. They had a falling out, and I think Uncle Edward always blamed himself for how things ended. He never shared the details, but I could tell it weighed on him." Walter's chest tightened as he realized the friend she was describing could very well be him. He felt a wave of guilt and sadness, knowing that his pride and immaturity might have contributed to Mr. Baker's pain. "Do you think he ever forgave that person?" Walter asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Clara looked at him thoughtfully. "I think he did," she said. "Uncle Edward wasn't the kind of man to hold grudges. He believed in second chances and letting go of bitterness. But I also think he wished he could have told that person himself." The words struck Walter like a hammer, leaving him reeling with emotion. He thought about the coat, the ticket, and the strange series of events that had brought them into his life. Was it possible that Mr. Baker had left the ticket for him intentionally, as a way of reaching out across time and distance? The idea seemed almost too extraordinary to believe, but it resonated with something deep inside Walter, an intuition he couldn't ignore. As Clara prepared to leave, she handed Walter a small envelope. "I found this while going through Uncle Edward's belongings," she said. "It might not mean anything, but it felt personal, so I kept it. Maybe it's something you should have." Walter took the envelope with trembling hands, his heart pounding as he thanked Clara and watched her walk away. Sitting alone in the cafe, he opened the envelope and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a letter written in Mr. Baker's distinctive handwriting. Walter's eyes filled with tears as he read the words. "Dear friend, if you're reading this, it means fate has worked its mysterious magic. I don't know if we'll ever meet again in this life, but I want you to know that I have never held anger in my heart for you. Life is too short for such things. If I could, I would tell you that you were one of the brightest lights in my life, even if our paths diverged. I hope this letter finds you well, and that it brings you some measure of peace. Remember, my friend, it's never too late to make things right, with others or with yourself. Yours always, Edward Baker." Walter sat there, the letter trembling in his hands as tears streamed down his face. The pain of regret mingled with a deep sense of gratitude. The coat, the ticket, the letter, they weren't coincidences. They were part of a larger story, one that had been waiting for Walter to find it. And now he knew what he had to do. Walter held the letter in his trembling hands long after the last words blurred through his tears. The cafe's gentle hum faded into the background, leaving him alone with the enormity of what he had just read. Edward Baker, the man who had once been a cornerstone of his youth, had carried their fractured bond in his heart until the very end. The words in the letter were both an absolution and an invitation, a call to action that Walter couldn't ignore. He had spent too many years burying his regrets beneath the routines of daily life, but now he had a chance to honor Edward's memory by taking the steps he should have taken long ago. The first step was clear. Walter needed to return to Edward's home, or at least what remained of it. The address Clara had given him for the estate sale organizer was also the location of Edward's house. Walter wasn't sure what he hoped to find there, but he felt an undeniable pull to revisit the place where Edward had spent his final years. Early the next morning, after a restless night filled with dreams of his younger self in Edward's classroom, Walter donned the coat and set out for the house. When he arrived, Walter was struck by how ordinary the house looked. It was a modest, single-story home with peeling paint and a garden overrun with weeds. Yet, as he stood before it, Walter felt a profound sense of reverence, as though he were standing on sacred ground. He walked up the cracked pathway to the front door and knocked, half expecting Edward himself to answer. Instead, a man in his 50s opened the door, his expression one of polite curiosity. "Can I help you?" the man asked. Walter introduced himself and explained his connection to Edward, choosing his words carefully. He mentioned the coat, the lottery ticket, and the letter, though he kept the ticket's value to himself for now. The man, who introduced himself as Tom, one of Edward's distant relatives, listened intently, his brow furrowing with interest. Uncle Edward spoke of a student he regretted losing touch with, Tom said after a moment. He didn't share many details, but he mentioned how much that person had meant to him. "If you were that student, then I think he'd be glad you're here." Tom invited Walter inside, and together they walked through the house, now stripped of most of its belongings. As Walter wandered through the rooms, memories surfaced with each step. The worn kitchen table reminded him of the lunches Edward used to share with students who stayed after class. The small bookshelf in the corner, though nearly empty, brought back visions of Edward pulling out thick volumes of history to bring his lessons to life. And then there was the living room, where a single-framed photograph sat on the mantel. Walter approached it with cautious reverence, his breath catching as he recognized the faces. The photo was old, the colors faded, but unmistakable. It showed Edward, younger and full of life, standing beside a group of students. And there, in the back row, was Walter himself, his teenage face brimming with the hope and confidence Edward had instilled in him. Seeing himself in the photograph was like stepping back in time, a bittersweet reminder of the bond they had shared and the distance that had grown between them. "I didn't know he kept this," Walter said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Tom smiled. Uncle Edward cherished his students. He kept more than just that photo. He gestured toward a box in the corner of the room. "Those are some of the things we didn't sell or donate. You're welcome to look through them." Walter hesitated for a moment before approaching the box. Inside, he found a collection of items that painted a vivid picture of Edward's life. Old lesson plans, handwritten notes from students, and a stack of letters tied together with twine. As Walter sifted through the contents, he came across something that made his breath catch, a small leather journal with Edward's initials embossed on the cover. He opened it carefully, the pages filled with Edward's neat handwriting. The journal wasn't just a record of Edward's daily life. It was a chronicle of his thoughts and reflections. Walter read passages that spoke of Edward's love for teaching, his hopes for his students, and his quiet struggles with loneliness in his later years. But it was one entry in particular that struck Walter like a lightning bolt. "Today, I donated the coat to the thrift store." I hesitated, knowing it held the ticket, but something in my heart told me it was time to let go. If the ticket finds its way to the right person, I hope they'll understand the gift for what it is, a chance to make things right. A chance to create something beautiful from what was lost. Walter's hand shook as he read the words, his mind racing to piece together the implications. Edward had known about the ticket. He had placed it in the coat intentionally, hoping it would find its way to someone who needed it. And somehow, through the mysterious workings of fate, it had found Walter. The realization was overwhelming, a tidal wave of gratitude, guilt, and all washing over him. Tom noticed Walter's reaction and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. Walter nodded, though his voice trembled as he spoke. "Edward left this for me," he said. "He wanted me to find it. I don't know how, but he knew." Tom looked at him with a mixture of surprise and understanding. "Uncle Edward believed in things like that," he said. "He used to say that life has a way of bringing people together when the time is right." As Walter left the house later that afternoon, the journal and letters safely tucked under his arm, he felt a profound sense of purpose. Edward had given him a gift, not just the ticket, but a second chance to honor their bond and carry forward the lessons he had taught. But there was still one question lingering in Walter's mind. What would he do with the winnings? The answer, he realized, wasn't just about money. It was about legacy, redemption, and the kind of man he wanted to be. Walter sat at his kitchen table that evening, surrounded by Edward's journal, the letter, and the lottery ticket that had become the fulcrum of his life. The weight of Edward's words, the intentions behind his final gift, settled heavily on Walter's heart. Edward had trusted him, not just with the winnings, but with something far more precious, the opportunity to make things right. Walter knew that this was no ordinary fortune. It wasn't money to squander or hoard. It was a bridge between the past and the future, a chance to honor Edward's memory and the values he had embodied. The decision came to Walter slowly, like the gradual unfolding of a flower. It wasn't about what he could buy or how much he could keep for himself. It was about using this unexpected windfall to bring light to others, just as Edward had brought light to him all those years ago. But how? The question lingered as Walter stared at the ticket, its numbers now etched into his mind. The money could do so much, yet the thought of claiming it for himself felt wrong. Edward's journal had made it clear that the gift wasn't meant to burden him. It was meant to free him. The next morning, Walter took a deep breath and called the state lottery office to verify the ticket. A polite woman on the other end of the line confirmed what he already knew. It was indeed a winner, and the jackpot was larger than he had imagined. Walter thanked her, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him, and hung up. With the winnings confirmed, the enormity of his decision loomed even larger. But for the first time, Walter felt clarity instead of doubt. He knew what he had to do. Walter began by drafting a plan, carefully listing the ways the money could be used to help others. His first thought was Edward's legacy. He decided to establish a scholarship fund in Edward's name, one that would support underprivileged students who, like Walter, needed someone to believe in them. The Edward Baker Memorial Scholarship would ensure that Edward's passion for education lived on, helping generations of young people achieve their dreams. Next, Walter thought about the town that had been both his and Edward's home for so many years. The local library, once a vibrant hub of learning, had fallen into disrepair. Walter remembered the afternoons he had spent there as a boy, devouring books and discovering worlds beyond his own. Using a portion of the winnings, he planned to renovate the library, adding a special section dedicated to Edward Baker, complete with his favorite books and a plaque honoring his contributions to the community. But Walter didn't stop there. He reached out to Clara, Edward's relative, and shared his plans with her. Together, they brainstormed additional ways to use the money for good. Clara suggested donating to local charities that supported education and mental health, causes close to Edward's heart. Walter agreed, feeling a sense of purpose with each decision they made. As the plans took shape, Walter couldn't ignore the voice inside him that reminded him to take care of his own needs as well. He decided to keep a small portion of the winnings, enough to make some long overdue repairs to his house and to ensure he could live comfortably in his twilight years. It wasn't about luxury. It was about allowing himself the peace of mind that Margaret would have wanted for him. Claiming the winnings was a surreal experience. Walter sat in the lottery office, the ticket clutched tightly in his hand, as the staff congratulated him and explained the process. He listened politely, though his mind was already racing with thoughts of the lives he could touch and the changes he could make. When the check was finally handed to him, Walter felt a strange mix of gratitude and responsibility. The money wasn't just his, it belonged to Edward, to the community, to the people who would benefit from the opportunities it would create. Over the following weeks, Walter's vision began to take shape. The scholarship fund was launched, and the first round of applications poured in from students across the town. The library renovation began, with architects and builders working to restore its former glory. Local charities received generous donations, allowing them to expand their programs and reach more people in need. Walter's small house, with its creaky floors and leaky roof, underwent repairs, transforming it into a warm and welcoming home once again. Despite the whirlwind of activity, Walter found time to reflect on the journey that had brought him to this point. He thought often of Edward, imagining the look of approval that would have crossed his face if he could see what his final gift had inspired. Walter felt a profound sense of connection to his late teacher, as though Edward's presence was guiding him through each step of the process. One evening, as Walter sat in his newly repaired living room, a soft knock on the door startled him from his thoughts. When he opened it, he found Clara standing there, holding a small box. "I thought you might like to have this," she said, handing it to him. Inside was a collection of Edward's personal belongings, a pocket watch, a set of pens, and a photograph of Edward as a young man, standing in front of the very school where he had taught for so many years. Walter felt tears prick his eyes as he looked through the items. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This means more to me than you can imagine." As Clara left, Walter sat with the box on his lap, the photograph resting on top. He thought about Edward's letter, his journal, and the incredible series of events that had brought the ticket into his life. It was no longer just about the money or the coat. It was about the lessons he had learned and the legacy he could carry forward. Walter knew there was still more to do, but for the first time in years, he felt truly at peace. Edward had given him a gift far greater than wealth, a second chance to make a difference, to live with purpose, and to honor the people who had shaped him. And for that, Walter would be forever grateful. The days turned into weeks, and Walter's life had found a new rhythm. For the first time in years, his heart felt light, his steps purposeful. The scholarship fund had already begun to make waves in the community, and the library renovation was nearing completion. Letters of gratitude from the charities he had supported poured in, each one a testament to the ripple effect of Edward's generosity. Yet, amidst all the good he was doing, Walter couldn't shake the lingering sense that there was more to Edward's gift than he had uncovered. The letter, the journal, the coat, it all felt too perfectly aligned to be mere coincidence. One afternoon, as Walter sat by the window with a cup of tea, a knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. He wasn't expecting anyone, and visitors were rare. When he opened the door, a man stood on the porch, his face weathered but kind. He introduced himself as James Baker, a name that immediately caught Walter's attention. James explained that he was Edward's nephew, recently returned from abroad after learning of his uncle's passing. "I've been going through some of Uncle Edward's things," James said, his voice tinged with emotion. "And I found something that I think you should see." Curiosity piqued, Walter invited James inside. They sat in the living room as James pulled out an envelope from his coat pocket. "Uncle Edward always spoke highly of a former student of his," James began, his eyes meeting Walter's. "He said this student changed his life as much as he changed theirs. He never mentioned a name, but when I found this, I knew it was meant for you." James handed Walter the envelope, its seal unbroken, and Walter's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was another letter, written in Edward's unmistakable handwriting. Walter unfolded it carefully and began to read. "Dear Walter, if you're reading this, then fate has brought you back into my life, as I always hoped it would. You were one of the brightest lights in my teaching career, a student who challenged me, inspired me, and reminded me why I chose this path. Our falling out was one of my greatest regrets, and not a day went by that I didn't wish I had reached out to you. When I purchased the lottery ticket, I never intended to claim it for myself. I had no need for such wealth, but I saw it as a way to create something meaningful. When I donated the coat, I hoped it would find its way to you. I knew you visited that thrift store, and I trusted that the universe would do the rest. Walter, this ticket was never about the money. It was about giving you the chance to see how extraordinary you are, to remind you that your kindness, your wisdom, and your heart can change the world. My only request is that you live fully, without regret, and use this gift to create the kind of legacy that we both dreamed of. With all my gratitude and affection, Edward Baker." Walter set the letter down, his hand shaking as tears streamed down his face. The room seemed to blur around him as Edward's words sank in. All this time, Walter had thought the ticket was a stroke of chance, a random twist of fate. But it wasn't random at all. Edward had planned everything, trusting that Walter would be the one to fulfill the potential he had seen in him all those years ago. James watched quietly, giving Walter the space to process the revelation. When Walter finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "He did all of this for me," he said, more to himself than to James. "Even after all these years." James nodded, his expression kind. "Uncle Edward believed in you," he said simply. "He always did." The next few days were a whirlwind of reflection and action for Walter. He visited the library, now nearly restored to its former glory, and spoke with the first recipients of the Edward Baker Memorial Scholarship. Each interaction reminded him of the power of Edward's vision and the responsibility he now carried. But it wasn't just about honoring Edward's memory. It was about living up to the trust and faith that Edward had placed in him. One evening, as Walter sat by the fire, the coat draped over his lap, he thought about the man he had been before finding the ticket. He had been content, yes, but also stagnant, weighed down by the regrets of his past and the fear of what might come next. Edward's gift had changed everything, not just his circumstances, but his very sense of self. Walter realized that the true gift wasn't the money or even the opportunities it had created. It was the reminder that it was never too late to make a difference, to heal old wounds, and to live a life of purpose. The final piece of Edward's puzzle came a week later, when Walter received a package in the mail. Inside was a small, ornate box with a note from Clara. "Uncle Edward wanted you to have this," the note read. Walter opened the box to find a gold pocket watch, its surface engraved with the words, "Time is the greatest gift of all." As Walter held the watch in his hands, he felt a profound sense of peace. Edward's legacy wasn't just about the money or the tangible changes it had brought. It was about the time he had given Walter, time to reflect, to grow, and to make amends. With that realization, Walter made a silent promise to Edward, to himself, and to the people whose lives he would continue to touch. He would use every moment he had left to live with intention, gratitude, and love. And for the first time in years, Walter felt truly free.